he says the other thing that really bothered him about that night when William and Kate came over for that first time was they didn't even have the decency to admit that they'd been super fans of Suits. So that felt like it was kind of a lie, since they really were, and they could have at least like been honest about that. And now they're acting like too cool for school. So that was kind of lame. They could have said something. But then he decided to think of it like, oh, they're just not brave enough to admit that they're super fans. Like, that's kind of sweet, you know, like they're kind of little starstruck. So that's actually why they didn't say anything. Okay, totally get it. She's huge. I mean, she's a huge name in Hollywood, so probably was a little bit scary for them. Hello, happy Friday. Welcome to another episode of I'll Spare You the Details. We're going through Prince Harry's book and we are almost done with it. Look, we only have a little bit left to do. Last episode, we ended with a fight. The first documented fight. Now, none of us believe that was the first fight they'd ever had. But we did read that this was the first time that Harry had sort of shown his true colors, and now Meghan has this character flaw to dangle over him, and she is using it to the fullest extent. And she says that he had better get some therapy because she's not about to raise kids or live in a home with him if he's going to have these rage issues. So she lays down the letter of the law. And so in this whole section, quite a bit of this section will be him at his therapy sessions. I felt similarly about this whole part as I did about when he was in Afghanistan. It's just a lot of talking to no specific end. My problem with therapists is when they don't really help you, they just kind of give you a stew pot with which to marinate in all of your feelings, and then you go there like once a week to marinate and think about yourself and think about your problems and like never really ever get over anything. And they're over there to add spices to the mix by helping you to recall all the times you've been wounded and injured, and they're over there just stirring the stew pot with you in it. And I kind of feel like that might have been what was happening here. I don't know. But anyway, in this section today, he's going to go to therapy. He's going to suddenly remember his mother with brilliant clarity. We are going to talk all about how hateful Pa is, like real hateful. And we're going to talk about how blindingly unfair William is constantly and continually. We're going to talk about the first time that really the first time Kate has a chance to meet Meghan. We're going to talk about the weird circumstances surrounding what happened to Meghan's dogs. Remember how she was real braggy about how she'd saved these dogs? Well, she abandoned one of them right quick. We're going to talk about how Harry is going to be, try to guilt trip Pa into dealing with the media. We're going to, she makes some wild claims as to why she left Suits. And then finally we'll get into the part where he tells the family, I want to marry Meg. He needs to go and propose. But of course, first he's got to ask Granny's permission, which, throws him on his back. I can't believe he's going to have to do that. And then we get into the actual proposal. And that's where we'll end, on the actual proposal. Now, before we get into the video, I gotta think, is there anything from the comments that we need to address from last time's video? Oh, there was quite a dichotomy in the comments about how one should prepare gravy and whether I was in the right to call them out for having made gravy at the time that they said they made it. Apparently, one can make gravy out of a packet or chicken stock, or in England, they have ready-made gravy. Now, I would venture to say that ain't gravy. But I see your point. They could devise some inferior method with which to make this gravy. But Meg being the foodie that she is, I would have assumed we would have gone right for the actual pan juices to make that gravy. Also, if you're going to go ahead and make your gravy out of your packet or with your chicken stock or with your jug of already made gravy, it stands to reason you might wait till the bird is close to being done before you let that mess bubble into oblivion on the stove. So we had some gravy debates in the comments. I stick with my original thesis. You ain't making gravy without pan juices. Okay. All right. Okay. Oh, then of course, I always forget this part, and I can't forget this part, y'all. Like and comment and subscribe, because there's the button down there, and you know what to do, and all these things. If you've been on, of course you know what to do. Y'all get so sick of creators telling you to subscribe. It's like, I know what I'm supposed to do here. So, if the spirit moves, consider it. But lots of people are watching and not subscribing, so I'm just here to beg. Please subscribe. Okay, let's get into this, because like I said, we have a lot to talk about, and it isn't as specific as some of his other stories, because, he goes into that therapy office, and it's a lot of meandering thoughts. A lot of him not able to articulate himself well, which makes it difficult for me to articulate what it is that he was even hoping to accomplish during these sessions. But the main thing is, he's got to prove to Megan that he's taking her concerns seriously and he is going to get therapy. Because remember, she said he had some outrageous anger issues, and he had better figure out a way to deal with that. And he had to find a new therapist. So he found one. And he feels like some of his anger is stemming from pain. Pain that he was never able to deal with at the death of his mother, and pain that no one took seriously. So he says that he gets to this little office. It was about 30 minutes away from Notcott. It's a small room, and he likes the girl immediately, who is his therapist. She's about 15 years older than him. But what he really likes about her is that she reminds him of Tiggy. Now, we remember Tiggy. She had been his nanny when he had been younger, and she'd taken care of him for years. She'd been the nanny before his mother died, and then she'd sort of become, I don't know about a surrogate mother, but maybe a little bit. He had a lot of confusing feelings about Tiggy. If you don't remember, he didn't talk a lot about her, but in the very beginning of the book, in part 1, when he's talking about his youth, or what he remembers of his youth, mostly starting around when Mummy died, he makes some comments about Tiggy that are almost sexual. So I think it's very interesting that he would now say that his therapist reminded him of Tiggy, because I think he doesn't say it outright, but he seems to sexualize or have weird mental relationships with women who are helping him get through things. And so anybody who sort of shepherds him in a sort of maternal role, he seems to attach some emotional feelings that are not typical for most men. Anyway, he makes the point to us that she reminds him of Tiggy, and he'd already told us how he felt about Tiggy, so I find it odd that he'd mention that to us, but whatever. He said immediately he starts sweating up a storm, because you know how he's got his sweating problems, and she nicely goes and brings him a fan and like points it right at him. So he's sitting there on the little green couch, and he's all kind of nervous, and he doesn't really know what to say. And so they decide to start at the most obvious point, Mummy's death, because clearly that's the thing that's bothered him his whole life. He says a lot of things that I find to be very interesting that I don't feel like he came to the conclusion of on his own. But in this text, he says that he presented certain feelings to the therapist, which I thought were completely understandable. Yet she sits there and keeps looking at him like, what? He's never wanted to talk about Mummy's death, because he feels like if he does, and he gets rid of some of this pain, the pain is all he has. He admits openly at this point, I don't remember her. I don't remember her face. I don't remember her laugh. I don't remember anything. And William had told me to go and look into some photo albums and maybe that would help jog my memory. He's like, it didn't work. So now all I've got is the pain. And I just don't want to give that up. And I'm afraid to come to therapy, and I'm afraid for them to help me get over that, because if we get over that, I have nothing. That makes total and perfect sense. And I don't understand why the therapist continues to look at him like, that's out in left field. Who'd ever feel that way? That makes sense to me. I get that. Anyway, so he keeps trying to explain. It's like a long thing where he keeps saying the same thing and she keeps staring at him. And he keeps saying the same thing and she keeps staring at him. I'm like, all right, we could have edited this a bit. At the end of this long and meaningless conversation, they finally get to the part, they finally dig down into what he really wants, something practical she can help him with. And he says, ultimately, what I want is to be able to cry, like really cry. I just need you to help me access my emotions because I seem like I can't do it. Now, for those of us reading the book, we're like, yeah, but Cress helped you cry and you kicked her to the curb. So I don't know if this therapist knows what she's getting into, but he claims that's what he wants because there's this heaviness in his chest, he says. The heaviness, he can't, he needs help excavating the heaviness. So she's going to help him get rid of the heaviness and help him to cry. Okay. That's session 1. Then we go into session 2. Session 2, he says, could he lie down on the couch and tell her all his problems? Wondering when you were going to ask. So we have everything about this book is so stereotypical. Then I went to my psychiatrist and laid down on the couch. It's like, I don't know who wrote this book, but it's somebody who didn't live real life, but watched others live it and thinks, oh, I think that's what I'm supposed to say at this part. Anyway, he lays down on the couch of the therapist, whatever she is. And he writes that he tells her about Cress and about the skiing holiday and how all the emotions had sort of fizzed up and he'd finally been able to cry, but just a little bit. I mean, it hadn't been like the sob fest he had been hoping that it would be, He really wanted a weep-a-thon is what he wanted, and he didn't get it. And he says that he had switched sadness for rage. In his opinion, that's what had happened here. So because he couldn't cry, he just got angry all the time. And he describes the scene in the kitchen with Meg. Well, it literally just says that he told his therapist, I described the scene with Meg. I wish he would have described it to us so we could have figured out what in the world happened there, but he doesn't. He vents about Pa and Willie. Again, I'm not skimming over this and not giving you guys the details. He literally doesn't say anything. He just says that I told her about this. I said about Pa and Camilla. But this is what I find wild. Okay, so he's saying about how he's talking all about the family and venting. But he writes this. I frequently stop myself mid-sentence at the sound of passers-by outside the window. If they ever knew! Prince Harry in there yapping about his family, his problems. Oh, the papers would have a field day. Or you could just write about it in a whole book. What is he... Does he understand what he's saying here? There I was, just yapping on and on about my family. And I just was terrified anyone would hear. Then I doubled back home and wrote it all down in a book. Okay. Truly, truly, truly. His stupidity knows no bounds. Okay, so that which led them around to the subject of the press. So he tells her, oh my goodness, what if somebody heard what I was saying? Can they hear outside? And so that gets him onto this object of the press, which for him is firmer ground. He definitely knows how he feels about the press. He just lets fly. He goes on and on and on about how disappointed he is in his countrymen and how they showed such contempt and they're so vile to the woman that he loves. And he says that, the press had always been cruel to him, but he hadn't thought that they would extend this scourging whip to the back of the woman he loved. And here she was, just this poor innocent from America. And how dare his country treat her in this way? Then he says this, and do you remember, I don't know if you remember from last episode, I said that now that we've gotten to this section with Meg, there's a whole lot of, let me set the record straight, but act like I'm telling you the story. Right? So there's a lot that does not feel organic about this section because it's very much them answering back to things that they heard in the press for years. And now this is their time to manipulate the story so that they can address certain issues. And this is one of them. He says he told his therapist, he said that he couldn't ever tell people how he felt because privately or publicly, people just rolled their eyes. They said I was whinging, said I only pretended to want privacy, said Meg was pretending as well. Oh, she's getting chased, is she? Well, give us a break. She'll be fine. She's an actress. She's used to the paps. In fact, she wants them. But no one wanted this. Like literally what we've all been saying. Hey, South Park. You know, it's like they don't want their privacy. They don't. Why don't they just own it? That's the thing that's so crazy to me. I think the thing that's bonkers to me is how dumb they think we are. Like they think that we're just gonna like, you know, we're in this collective trance where none of us remember that she wasn't very popular on Suits, where none of us are gonna remember that there weren't any tabloids about them, where none of us are gonna recall that we loved them at a certain point. Like, they think they can just lie to us like this? Maybe you can find one joker who'd lived his whole life under a rock and persuade him of this, but you cannot tell all of America and all of the Commonwealth and all of Britain, remember, you hated us and you always have. It's like, no, we didn't. Anyway, he claims that it just hurt him that everyone would say that Meg loved it because, you know, she didn't. And, you know, the attacks she was getting were leading to her having panic attacks. In fact, he claims that one time she had even gotten a text from a perfect stranger telling her that he was going to put a bullet in her head. Who among us believes that? Who would do that? What? You're going to tell me, okay, Meghan has spent her entire life telling us a story about how she saved the Western world and women across the globe from dishwater hands because she said not all women have to wash the dishes, and she changed the face of dishwashing campaigns at the tender age of 11. You're going to tell me a person who can't stop telling that story would, for the first time in forever, we finally hear that, oh, by the way, one time somebody out of the blue texted her and said they were going to shoot her in the head. You know what I'm saying? Like anything she can use to talk about herself and to put herself in the light. You're going to tell me that this is, I've never heard this story. But suddenly, this revelation in this book, there's people who are hounding her to such a degree that she's receiving threats on her actual cell phone, her private number. Please. So he's super angry, going from whining to being angry. And the therapist finally cuts in and says that, you know, his complaints, it sounds pretty rough. She admits, like, if that's really the world you're dealing with, wow, that's pretty hard. But then she says, after hearing you talk about all of this, I have to say that you just sound like you're stuck. And she tells him what we've all been saying since like literally day one. It would appear to me that you are still functioning as 12-year-old Harry. And that there is an Arrested Development situation here. Now, she didn't say Arrested Development. I don't think he'd know what that meant. But she does tell him, you're functioning as 12-year-old Harry. And you're viewing the world through that paradigm. So, of course, the world feels like a very difficult and scary place because you're trying to solve adult problems with a 12-year-old mind. He's horrified. I didn't like the sound of that. I felt a bit insulted. Calling me a child seems a bit rude. It's like, all right, well, you can't go to therapy and get help if you don't anticipate your personal feelings being trampled a little bit, right? Because that's kind of why you go. Because if you could solve your own problems, you wouldn't be there lying on that couch, right? You would not be there trying to have your brain sorted by a stranger if you could sort it on your own. But the therapist does say to him, she's like, look, you say you want the truth. You say you value the truth above all. Well, that's the truth. You are struggling and you're stuck. Okay. So I know I said at the beginning of this, I don't know how much help the therapist was. This was a helpful statement, but could she have said anything other? I mean, unless she was going to be completely and totally lax on the job, I mean, she had to say this at the very least. So, you know, they had gone over their allotted time. They had talked for 2 hours straight. It's time for him to leave. They set up another date to talk. He asks if he can hug her. Why wouldn't he want to hug Tiggy? They hug. And then he says that he goes out. His head is swimming. He wishes he could just like kind of walk up and down the street and just think about everything they talked about. But unfortunately, he can't do that without the Paps, you know, hounding him. So he's got to go home and just, and I'm like, but you have access to all of the palace grounds. Why don't you go walk there in peace and serenity? But then how am I going to complain? All right. Third session. He says that the therapist had actually met Tiggy before. Again, with the Tiggy references, which he thinks is an astounding coincidence. What a small world. And he says that they talk about how much he and Willie often turned women into surrogate moms, which they had done with Tiggy. And he says that it did make him feel better to have people in his life, like maternal figures, he has to admit. But what he also struggled with simultaneously was the guilt. Like, Mommy would be so hurt and so crushed. And he says that one of the things, he also reveals to his therapist at this time, that one of the reasons he'd been reluctant to come to therapy is that, to his understanding, Mommy had also received therapists, but they hadn't been any help to her. In fact, he says that, to his understanding, some of the therapists had even exploited her and preyed upon her. And so he just didn't feel like therapists were really a safe option if you really needed help. Again, he makes statements, provides no evidence. He does not tell us anything as to why he came to that conclusion. What had happened to Diana with a therapist in which she had been preyed upon? I don't remember that. I mean, admittedly, I'm not like, you know, I don't know much about Diana. Like, I've read like 2 books. But I don't remember anything happening in which she was exploited and preyed upon by numerous therapists. People, tell me in the comments. Is there evidence, instances of this having happened to her? I don't recall that. Then he says this, and this is probably the truest thing he's ever said about his mother in this entire book. He says that he and his therapist talked about Mommy's parenting and how she could sometimes overmother and then disappear for stretches. It seemed an important discussion, but it also seemed disloyal, and he felt exceedingly guilty about saying that out loud. Thank God he's finally saying it out loud. I think we all noticed that was going on. And also, it seems like when she would be around, like overmother, definitely. But also, it doesn't ever feel to me like when she was with the boys that she was functioning as a mother. Like, it was always like real big sister-y stuff. Or like a fun babysitter. But I don't feel like she knew how to be a mom. At all. Like, I don't think she possessed the ability to shape and mold the boys' destiny in any positive, meaningful, adult and grown-up way. We'll talk about an example of that later. But I mean, there's a difference between a parent having fun with their kids. For sure, have fun with your kids, by all means. But it seems to me that Diana did a lot of, you know, complaining, like sharing things with her boys that she didn't need to share with them. A lot of like not asking, like not calling up the best in them, but sort of encouraging some of their like worst traits. You know, if they wanted to be rebellious, telling that, like encouraging rebellion, encouraging rule breaking, you know what I mean? Like, it just seems like she struggled to really be in that role of mother. And when it wasn't fun, she would dip out, you know? Anyway. Then they talk about how, he goes on this super long jag about how nobody in the public understands what it is to be a prince. Well, fault us for that. I mean, why would we know? Why would we know what it's like? But he goes on and on about how nobody understands it, and it's all because they've been watching too much Disney, and they think it's all a fairy tale, but it actually isn't. He is a human being. Must he recall the time when he sat there getting his HIV test and noticed his blood was red? He's just like you. He's got red blood, even if you think it's blue. Actually, it's red. And he says, he goes on this long stretch about how there had been a very famous intellectual who had written an essay on the royal family. And there was a section in there, though he does not quote it, so I don't know how accurate this is. There's no quotation marks here. But I think the summary of it is this. He says that the essayist wrote, "Our current royal family doesn't have the difficulties in breeding that pandas do, but pandas and royal persons alike are expensive to conserve and ill-adapted to any modern environment. But aren't they interesting? Aren't they nice to look at?" So he'd been really offended because he said, you know, people were being taught not to think about the royal family as human beings, and that they were no more interesting than an exotic zoo animal. And so he said, was it any wonder that they were being destroyed like they were in the press because nobody thought of him as a human being? And now that Meghan is tied to him, no one's going to think of her as a human being either. He says that on the one hand, he did feel like it had been an astute observation, because he says that he did feel as though he lived in a zoo. But he says that by the same token, he knew that as a soldier, turning people into animals or into non-people is the first step in mistreating them and in destroying them. And if a celebrated intellectual could dismiss him as an animal, what hope for the man or woman on the street? So basically, all the stupid people in the world won't be able to put two and two together and figure out that he's a human being if this celebrated intellectual somehow couldn't figure that out. So even in that, what an elitist statement. Like, he's literally just said, we can't dehumanize people because all those idiots out there won't be able to figure out that I'm a human. It's like, we can't dehumanize people, let me dehumanize all of England. Okay, that's a perfect Harryism. But I will say this, if that is truly what you believed, in as far as he's able to conceive of his existence, if he truly believed that he had been reduced to nothing more than an exotic zoo animal, and if he really believed that the world saw him as a non-human, what a frightening place that would be. I can see feeling panicky if you felt like the whole world looked at you as a disposable object as soon as you know, they get tired of the glitz, you know? But I think the thing here that is so sad is that we know that his perspective is just completely and totally askew from reality. Everything in this book so far has just been lies on lies on lies, exaggerations, twisting of reality, my truth matters more than the facts. And so for him to come at us with this, if this whole book had been sanity and clarity and, you know, the ringing of truth, then for him to come and say this, I would have so much more empathy for what he's saying here. But the problem is that this is just more made up garbage, you know? Now, that's not to say that he can't have one or two things that are true in all the mess. So I do think that there is some truth to what he's saying, in that we do enjoy, as a culture, objectifying famous people because, I don't know, maybe for some, it's maybe our way of getting back at them for having more than we do. I don't know. But regardless, there are far more people who enjoy the royal family and respect the royal family and respect the institution of the royal family, that I don't understand why he doesn't play more into that. Like, you could always be distracted by your detractors, but why would you when you have so many more positives than negatives, you know? But I mean, it is human nature. You can hear 10 good things and one bad thing and you'll believe the bad instead of the 10 good things. I get that, but that's a choice, right? So when it comes to intrusive thoughts, an intrusive thought can come into your head, and sometimes, you know, that's just going to enter into your head, but you have the power over that second thought, right? So a bad thought comes into your head, everybody hates me. Second thought should say, that's not true. That's not true. You know that's not true. What about all these other things that have happened that are good and right? You know what I'm saying? But Harry doesn't seem to believe he has power over the second thought. And that's his ultimate problem. Anyway, then we go on to some more of this rewriting the narrative, right? So that's all this section is. Rewrite the narrative. He says that he and the psychiatrist talked about his past drug use. He says, do you think I have an addictive personality? But he actually doesn't think he has one. He wants her to validate what a success he's been in handling his drug use. Because he writes, do you think I have an addictive personality? More accurately, what I wanted to know was, if I did have an addictive personality, where would I be right now? Hard to say. Hypotheticals, you know, says the therapist. But she asked if I'd used drugs. Well, yeah. I told her some wild stories. And she says, well, I am rather surprised that you're not a drug addict. And if there was one thing to which I did seem undeniably addicted, however, it was the press. So the therapist says, okay, well, you're not a drug addict, but you definitely seem like you don't know how to turn off this addiction to the news. And she says that, you know, his constant reading of it and raging of it is obviously a compulsion. And he laughs and he's like, true, but I mean, that's such shit. And she laughs. They are. But nothing is resolved, right? She doesn't steer him away from this obvious compulsion. You know, he's like, yeah, I know, it's a real problem. I'm not going to stop, so don't try. And I just don't see what the use as therapist is. But that's rich right over there, with him wanting a pat on the back about how, you know, look at you handling your massive drug habit. Who says he's not a drug addict? That's my question. Anyway, the next section, he goes in for therapy number 4. And this whole section is him recalling, like, it's like he's watching a film reel, and it's all these memories of him and Mummy and Willie and all of this. And it's just like one episode after another of him finally, for the first time, having these wonderful memories of his mother. And remember, he says he couldn't have, he hadn't been able to remember anything. And now he was having these really vivid, bright memories, thousands like rushing in at him at a time. I don't know what this therapist did, but part of what she did was to bring sense memory into the whole thing. This guy and his mom's perfume, you guys, I can't even. Because of course we already know all the stories about how Meghan wore his mother's perfume. Now he's never mentioned that, but he does say that his therapist urged him to get a bottle of Mummy's favorite perfume. He says he'd asked, he notes to us that he'd reached out to Mummy's sister to ask for the name of the perfume. He could have just asked Meghan. And he says it was Van Cleef and Arpels. And that at the start of the session, he would lift the lid, take a deep sniff, and it was like taking a tab of LSD. Here come the memories. If only it was that easy. He says that, you know, a lot of the things he remembered were him and Mummy and Willie just having a lot of fun. Them going into her room at breakfast time and sitting on the waterbed, and them jumping up and down, screaming and laughing and rolling around, eating breakfast in the bed. He remembers when she invited them to go have a chat with Christy Turlington, Claudia Schiffer, and Cindy Crawford. What a confusing time that was for him, especially at the, you know, onset of puberty. He talks about how much he remembered kissing her soft neck and smelling her perfume and laying in bed with her. Anyway, so he goes on and on and on. But one of the things that I think is interesting, and it goes back to what I was saying earlier, is that a lot of the memories that he has of Mummy are of her basically encouraging him to 2 things. Break the rules, and the press is your deadly enemy, right? So you can see that he internalized those things. And if we are to believe that Harry really struggled with intellectual prowess and maybe just wasn't like the sharpest crayon, in the box, it would seem that he was all the more susceptible to the suggestions about life from his mother. So what she told him, he believed, and I think he's going to take it to the grave. One of the memories he has of is of Mummy stuffing sweets into his socks. When he'd go off to school to Ludgrove, he wasn't allowed to bring any outside sweets because they provided tablefuls of candy, so you didn't need to bring your own candy. But anyway, he says that he remembers one day at Ludgrove, Mummy stuffing sweets into his socks. Outside sweets were forbidden, so Mummy was flouting school rules, giggling as she did so, which made me love her even more. I remember both of us laughing as we buried the sweets deep in the sock and me squealing, "Oh, Mummy, you're so naughty!" And I remember the brand of those sweets, Opal Fruits, aka Starbursts. But she's got such an immaturity about her, right? Like, all of his memories involve her giggling as she breaks the rules. And I feel like to become closer to her, he has felt in this journey away from the royal family that it was the royal family who didn't protect her. It's their fault that she's dead. And in her honor, he is going to wreck every rule that they've ever established. And then he has another flash of a memory. And this one I thought was just unbelievably emotionally abusive and also sort of physically abusive. He says that he remembers going to tennis lessons in the car. And he says that he remembers Mummy driving and Willie and he were in the back. He says that without warning, she trod on the accelerator and they went rocketing ahead up narrow streets, blasting through red lights, whipping around corners. He said Willie and he were strapped into their seats so they couldn't look out of the back window, but they had a sense of what was chasing them. Paps on motorbikes and mopeds. Are they going to kill us, Mummy? Are we going to die? Mummy, wearing big sunglasses, peered into the mirrors. After 15 minutes and several near smashes, Mummy slammed on the brakes, pulled over, jumped out, and walked toward the Paps. Leave us alone, for God's sake. I'm with my children. Can't you leave us alone? Trembling, pink-cheeked, she got back in the car, slammed the door, rolled up the windows, leaned her head on the steering wheel, and wept, while the Paps kept clicking and clicking. I remembered the tears falling from her big sunglasses, and I remembered Willie looking frozen like a statue. And I remember the Paps just firing and firing and firing. And I remembered feeling such hatred for them and such deep and eternal love for everyone in that car. Can you imagine, as a young child, experiencing that? Your mother driving like a maniac through the streets, being pursued by what you thought was the absolute enemy, her getting out, doing battle with them, getting in the car, seeing her weep. Like, the whole thing is so completely inappropriate for a mother to have let her children live through that. And for what? And for what? I don't understand why she would do that to them. I don't understand why she wouldn't protect them from that reality if it was a reality. That doesn't make any sense whatsoever. I also am like, didn't she have any bodyguards or anything at this time? I'm not sure what her security system was like after she left, after she got a divorce, but it would seem to me that there would have been somebody there to protect her. I mean, what in the world? Like, this whole scene is just so, it's just so emotionally abusive to those kids. And physically abusive when you consider the way she was driving. And so I just think, how could Harry not have had this impression of life stamped on his brain indelibly? I just don't see how he could have gotten past this. If this is the way if your mother had led you to believe your whole life that the Paps were monsters, and then she ends up dying at the hands, arguably Harry is choosing to see the world, or just choosing to see that accident as the Paps' fault. But it would appear that she had given him evidence his whole life to believe that that could be a final conclusion. So I can hardly blame him. If this was how his mother taught him to look at the world, well, no wonder he's had a hard time. His next memory is of he and Willie and Mummy. They're on Necker Island, and all of the three of them are sitting on this cliff in this little hut. And then beneath them, there came a boat of photographers looking for them. Well, they'd been playing with water balloons earlier, Willie and Harry and Mummy, and So she quickly rigged up a catapult, divided the balloons among them, and then all three of them began to rain down the water balloons on the photographers. He writes that the sound of her laughter that day had been lost to him for years, and that finally it came back to him loud and clear, and that he cried tears of joy with remembering that day, and for the first time being able to remember her laughter. Again, I just can't decide if what she's being is fun or if she's being irresponsible as a mother. Because if you don't want photographers in your life, why are you giving them the photo of you throwing water balloons with your kids at them? It seems like she's just playing with fire all the time and then crying when she gets burned. Okay, so finally, we're done with the therapy session. We go into this one section where he writes that he and Pa and Camilla are just, they're starting to be at odds with each other. He's trying to explain to them that he can't deal with the press anymore. He says that Meg has paid tens of thousands of dollars in legal fees to deal with the press, and he just doesn't know why Pa's not taking it more seriously. When Pa refuses to take it more seriously and continues to say, don't read it, darling boy, Harry shushes him and is like, don't call me a boy anymore. I'm not a boy, I'm a man. And if I hear you say that one more time, I'm going to lose it. And it's like, this is what you so often see when people start going to therapy. It's like suddenly they are empowered, and when they believe that they've been a pushover, then in order to counteract having been once a pushover, now they're super aggressive. So I feel like Harry's having some of that, like some of this therapy hangover. Anyway, he wants to let Pa know he's not a boy, and he's here to tell him like a man how it ought to be. And then he starts in on this old guilt trip. He says that he tells Pa, why have I got to beg you, Pa? Why is it that this isn't a priority for you? Why is this not causing you anguish, keeping you up at night, that the press are treating Meg like this? You adore her. You told me so yourself. You bonded over your shared love of music. You think she's funny and witty and impeccably mannered. You told me. So why don't you care, Pa? Why don't you care? It's like, why don't you just shut up with the old guilt trip? He does care. He cares the same way for Meg as he cares about when Catherine is maligned or Camilla is maligned. But what difference will it make for him to come out and make a statement? He can't come out and make a statement every day. Just ignore it. All right, so then he's also simultaneously outraged because they just say, oh, it's just Meg's turn. We've all had our time. It's all been hard for all of us. It's just Meg's turn, but it'll all die down. That's the truth of it. You don't want to hear the truth, Harry? He says that the thing that really bothered him is that Camilla suggested to Meg that Harry should become the Governor General of Bermuda. And then if he did that, that might solve their problems because that would remove them from the red hot center of the maelstrom. And Harry's like, right. And one added bonus of that plan would be that it would get us out of the picture. Because it's always about you, Camilla. You're always trying to shove me off to the side. Now my girlfriend trying to get us off to Bermuda. How dare you? Then he has another little sob session where he and William had gone to lay flowers on Mummy's grave at the end of 2017. And while they were there, they had this sort of vulnerable conversation. Harry tries to talk to William about, look, it's been really rough for Meg and I just need you to listen to me. And I'm like, you've been telling everybody that for a while now. Everyone's been listening to you, Harry. And according to him, he says that William tells him not to worry, that nobody believes it. So just don't you believe it. Nobody else does. And Harry said, that's not true. They do. It's drip fed to them day by day, and they come to believe it. And they don't even know they're believing it. That's the trouble, with this kind of racism. It's not overt. It's sort of drip, drip, drip. So that eventually, suddenly, you're a racist and you didn't even know it. But he says that William's still like, I don't really think it's that big of a deal. Why don't you just let it go? So they stand there quietly for a while, and then he says that William shares his extraordinary inner thought. He says that he thinks that Mummy is there, meaning right there among them, and he ventures to say that he agrees. And William says that he thinks that she's been a part of his life, guiding him and setting things up for him, that she's helped him to start his family. And he says that he feels as though she's helped, and William even says, I feel as though she's helping you now too. And Harry is like, oh yeah, well, absolutely. And totally agrees. He says he feels the same. And he says, I feel like she handpicked Meg for me. But in this crushing blow, Willie takes a step back, looking concerned. Well, that's taking it a bit far. Well, now, Harold, I'm not sure about that. And I wouldn't say that. So Harry is just devastated that once again, William is baiting him, thinking that they're having this moment together. And then Willie pulls the carpet right out from underneath him, laying him right out on his back. Okay. So now we get back to Meg. Meg's back. And then we have this ridiculous scene where he finally decides to venture as they're in the kitchen cooking and cherishing their little life as they do. He suddenly blurts out, I don't know, I had my back to her. I froze mid-sentence, hesitant to go on, hesitant to turn around. You don't know what has? Yes? I love you. I listened for a response. There was none. Now I could hear her, or feel her walking toward me. I turned, and there she was, right before me. I love you too, Has. So finally they're saying things that aren't really exactly revelatory. They've been together for a while and living with each other at various times. So I would hope that you love the person. Anyway, saying so out loud set things into motion automatically. And so now they can decide, okay, so we've said that, what next? I don't know. I never understand why people make such a big deal out of I love you. Especially when you're already sleeping together. It seems like, well, I should hope so. I did just give you my body. But anyway. They've got to decide, are we moving in together? And he asks her, would you consider moving to Britain? I mean, obviously that's where he's based. And she acts like she's got to think about it. I can't just leave my show. I mean, quit my job, start a new life with you. I mean, I can't do that. Unless, of course, moving would mean that this is a forever relationship. If it's a forever commitment, I would consider giving up Suits. It's a huge role for me. It's my entire career. It's a lot that you're asking of me, but I could consider it. We could start talking about me considering it. Okay, so after she actually lets him believe that, they hug, they kiss, they sit down to eat their supper. They're all just, enjoying the moment. And then he says that he's worried that she's going to, hop up and be like, you know what, actually, I take that back. Has, I'm sorry, I just can't. I don't know what I said. I don't agree to it. I'm flying home. He's worried that she's going to get back to Toronto, change her number, block him, cut him out, ghost him. And I'm like, you just told her that you loved her. And then he says that part of me thought she'd be smart to do that. I'm like, if only you'd been as smart. Okay, we gotta hurry along. The hour is racing by. Then we go on to this little story. He tells us that the Invictus Games are being held in Toronto. And he says that Meg was a little bit nervous. They were especially nervous because this was going to be their first official royal engagement together. So of course people knew they were together, but she had never accompanied him to anything with the royal stamp on it. So, but I don't know why they didn't do it sooner, because he says this. He says Meg was a bit nervous. Me too. But we had no choice. Had to be done, we said. We'd hidden from the world long enough. But had everyone knows that y'all are together. Also, this would be the most controlled, predictable environment that we could hope for. Above all, once we did a public date, might reduce the bounty on our heads among the paps, which at this point was running at around 100,000 pounds. What? No, it wasn't. If a paparazzi could get 100,000 pounds from one picture of you, I can guarantee you we would have seen more of them. What is he talking about? £100,000? I'd turn into a paparazzi if I could get for one picture. But the thing that was really just marred the whole occasion was the fact that they'd had a great time during it, but that Meg had been slammed in the press, particularly the British press, because she was wearing ripped jeans. And he says that they attacked everything she wore, down to the flats and the button-down shirt. But it had been pre-approved by the palace. So where did they even get off saying half the stuff they were saying? No one bothered to mention that it had been pre-approved, and by no one, he means the palace. They did not come running to her aid, even though they said the ripped jeans were totally fine. So, you know, it just really just struck another blow at his heart because, you know, if they had just been able to say one kind word about her, what a world of difference it would have made. But unfortunately, they just couldn't summon the energy. Okay, so now we get on to the part where he tells his private secretary, Elf, and Jason that he wants to propose. But he says that Elf said, well, okay, but let me do some fast digging into the protocols there because it might not be as easy as you think it is to marry this American divorcee. Harry's flabbergasted. What? But everybody's divorced and everyone's married to everybody else, so what's wrong here? He acts like he's never even thought that this could be a thing. But he just finished telling us a while back that somebody had written this long expose about the fact that he was involved with a divorcee. And he was super offended about it, that in these times, they would still be saying something. So now that his private secretary is saying, hey, let me just check and see if this is okay, he's again floored. Hadn't he already been introduced to the idea that this could be a problem? Also, can he recall nobody in his family having had problems with this? Apparently, he's so self-involved. He had no idea the story of Aunt Margot and Aunt Margot being told that she could not marry that one guy because he was divorced, and how that had completely changed the trajectory of her life, right? He'd had no idea about that. I just find that unbelievable. How could he not? The rest of us knew that story, but it's his own aunt and he doesn't even know. All he knows is that she gave him a biro pen. Okay, so he says that they do a little bit of digging, and in the process, he finds out all about his relatives who had been they'd been his people lo these many years. He didn't know Aunt Margot's scenario. He didn't know the Duke of Windsor's scenario. All he knows is himself. So after his private secretary gets done looking at the protocol, he comes back and he says, okay, you can't just ask her out of the blue. You have to ask Granny's permission to marry Meghan. Harry's like blown away by this. Now the thing is that he knew that his own father had to ask permission to marry Camilla, but somehow he had forgotten that, or it hadn't struck him as odd at the time. But now that he's got to do it, he's blown away. She has every right to tell you no, so you need to be prepared for that. And Harry's like, what am I gonna do? Just fall out of love with her? You know, none of you have been in love before. You don't understand the power. Anyway, they're gonna go on a hunting trip, and he decides that that's when he'll ask Granny because she's always in a great mood when they go hunting. They're going bird hunting, and they, you know, they're all kitted out, they're in the cars, they're driving out, and he happens to be in a car with Pa and Willie. And Pa asks him, just as a matter of common courtesy, how's Meg doing? And Harry says she's good, and Pa asks, is she going to continue, you know, working? Is she going to keep being an actress? And Harry says, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I wouldn't think so. I expect she'll want to be with me doing the job, you know, which would rule out Suits since they film in Toronto. And Pa says, just look, here's the thing, Harry, darling boy. You know there's not enough money to go around. So I just want to put that bug in your ear. I don't just like have all this cash flow to be supporting you and Meg. Harry's like, what's he banging on about, you know? He can't understand what in the world his dad's talking about. And Charles expounds upon it. He says he can't pay for anybody else. Like he's already having to pay for William and Catherine. Now, this triggers something in Harry. Suddenly, he's like, he's really mad because he says that William and Catherine are supported by Pa officially, but it's not out of any generosity of Pa's. That's just the way it works. You know, he holds the purse and he parcels out the money, but it's not out of any generosity of his heart that he is supporting the kids. That's the way the monarchy works. And so he feels like it's a slight for no reason. And he's like, you know, what, do you want Meghan to start making her own clothes? Like, what costs are you saying I'm going to have to cut here? But he says it suddenly became abundantly clear to him that it wasn't about the money. He says that Paul might have decided that the rising cost of maintaining them, he says that Paul might have dreaded the rising cost of maintaining them, but the real thing he couldn't stomach was having somebody new dominating the monarchy, grabbing the limelight, someone shiny and new coming in and overshadowing him, and Camilla. So Paul had lived through that before, and he didn't have any interest in living through it again. When William had brought Catherine in, he hadn't loved that. In fact, he had tried to convince Catherine that she should change her name so that it's Catherine with a K, so that she didn't also have the same royal cipher with the crown and the C that he and Camilla both shared. So Paul had always, these many years, been trying to kick the young, pretty, shiny things out of the way so he could have his big day. This was nothing new for Paul. All right, so after he gets done spewing that venom, he says he finally finds a moment to go up and ask Granny, might he marry Meghan? He saw her alone collecting the dead birds with her hunting dogs, you know, out there by herself. And so he scuttles up and he approaches wanting to know, might he be given the permission? He goes up to her and she's having a grand old time out there with the dogs and the birds and the hunting, but he's just standing there hem-hawing and, you know, wringing his hands and shuffling his feet. And so she's like, okay, out with it. What's going on?
Granny, you know I love Meg very much, and I've decided that I'd like to ask her to marry me. And I've told her that I have to ask your permission before I can propose. So I'm doing it because I have to.
Granny's like, you have to?
And he's like, well, yeah, that's what your staff told me. And that's what my staff told me. And I guess I have to. So what you gonna say?
And Granny, because she's funny, says, well, then I suppose I have to say yes. Harry squints.
You feel you have to say yes? Well, what's that mean? Are you saying yes or are you not saying yes?
And anyway, finally he realizes that she's just kidding around with him. And then after he stands there sufficiently looking stupid, he realizes that she did just say yes. And so, oh, good. And so he's like, oh,
you were joking. Oops, well, okay, Granny, fabulous. Thank you, love you. I'd ask for a hug, but you're cold, so I won't.
And now it's time to have the ring made. He says that he had taken Meg's jewelry box to give to a designer so he'd know her size. He needed the whole jewelry box. He had chosen one of Mummy's bracelets with which to have the ring made. He'd asked, of course, William's permission first, and William, to his credit, hadn't hesitated for a second, shockingly, according to Harry. Because the truth is, he did seem to like Meg, despite the fact that he was often seeming so concerned about her. This is the first time he mentions that Kate and William have met Meg. He writes that he had seen William and Catherine and Meg interacting. At the last time Meg had come to visit, Meg had actually invited them over and had cooked dinner for them. He says that during the dinner, William had a cold and was sneezing and coughing, and Meg had scuttled upstairs and brought some homeopathic remedies down, some oregano and some turmeric, to help him with his coughing. And that William had seemed really charmed by it and actually seemed quite moved that Meg would be looking for a solution and, you know, offer her little worthless remedies. And he says that, you know, the sort of unfortunate thing is that from the table, Kate announced that William had never taken such unconventional remedies. Why does Harry make a point of that? I don't get that. Like, I feel like that I can totally see Catherine saying that, but you know how she's got such a lovely, charming way about her? Like, she would have said it with a laugh, like sort of like at William, like, oh, that's new for you. You've never taken anything like that. You know, not in a mean way, like trying to downplay Meghan's efforts. Just, you know, she and William have such a lovely, charming, jokey sort of a little relationship. I don't think any of us reads that and goes, oh, you know, Kate was really having a go at Meghan's offering. Anyway, he says the other thing that really bothered him about that night when William and Kate came over for that first time was they didn't even have the decency to admit that they'd been super fans of Suits. So that felt like it was kind of a lie, since they really were, and they could have at least like been honest about that. And now they're acting like too cool for school. So that was kind of lame. They could have said something. But then he decided to think of it like, oh, they're just not brave enough to admit that they're super fans. Like, that's kind of sweet, you know, like they're kind of little starstruck. So that's actually why they didn't say anything. Okay, totally get it. She's huge. I mean, she's a huge name in Hollywood, so probably was a little bit scary for them. Then he says that there was just one other discordant note. It's just the way the two women dressed, you know. Meg was so down to earth in her ripped jeans and bare feet. And Catherine came dressed to the nines, like always, you know. So that's kind of, I don't know if the two women can get along, you know, since one wears shoes and one doesn't, but I don't know. Maybe they'd be able to get past it. Maybe it's not a big deal after all. Then he goes back to talking again about the bracelet. So it's kind of a really disjointed thing. He's talking about making the ring. Then he goes off on this tangent about when they first met. Now he's back to the ring. So he's going to harvest the diamonds from the bracelet for the ring. And then he's going to get a blood-free diamond from Botswana. Okay. How do you know if it's a blood-free diamond? They could tell you anything. Anyway. He tells the guy it's got to be rushed. Okay, now, here's our last story. I promise. We're almost done. We're coming to the home stretch. Meg has packed up her home. She's coming to the UK to stay now. And he says that the show writers were happy to get rid of her, quite honestly, because they were super frustrated by the fact that, according to Harry, the show writers were being advised by Palace Comms that they had to change lines of dialogue and what her character was doing and how she could act. And the show writers were not having any of this. Like, they're super sick of it. And so they were happy to get rid of her. She was happy to leave the stressful job where they were being told what to do. Does any of us even believe that? What? I do not think that the Palace Comms could have had any say over what writers in Canada were doing on their show. But anyway, she had agreed to shut down her website. Remember the TIG? I don't even know what that stands for. She'd abandoned all her social media, again, at the behest of the comms team. She'd said goodbye to her friends, goodbye to her car, and also one of her dogs. Okay, so remember, she'd had 2 dogs. One of the dogs' name was Bogart. The other one's name was Guy. Harry says that Bogart had to be let go because he had been so traumatized by the siege of the house and the constant ringing of the doorbells and the paps banging on the doors all night and the flashes and the bombardment and the neighbors, you know, with cameras and all of this, that the dog's demeanor had changed towards Meg. And whenever Meg was around, he was exceedingly aggressive. He'd become a guard dog, but he was guarding himself against Meg because, you know, it was her fault, according to the dog, that his life had changed so egregiously. And he says that one of Meg's neighbors graciously agreed to adopt him. How many of us don't just believe that she abandoned that dog because she was sick of it? He probably, if she really had gotten him from a shelter, he probably had problems for a while, but now she could blame the paparazzi on the fact that she was abandoning this dog. That it was a paparazzi who had made him aggressive and nothing she'd ever done. All I can say is sometimes dogs are smarter than people. But she had allowed scruffy little Guy to come. But then we've got another strange little story about the dog Guy. So she says that she's bringing Guy along. Poor little Guy, that little beat up beagle that she had brought to a better fate, you know, bringing the little beat up beagle home with her. And Guy was having a hard time because he missed Bogart, but there was greater reasons for him to be having a hard time. Days before Meg was supposed to leave Canada, Guy had run away from the person who was watching him. So I guess she had somebody keeping her dogs, and he'd run away, and then he'd been found miles away from Meg's house. By the way, he wants you to know Meg was at work when this happened, okay? So it's not her fault that this happened, all right? Okay? It's not her fault that her other dog, she had to get rid of her other dog because he was aggressive towards her. And it's not her fault that Guy ran away and had his back legs run over because she was at work, after all. Now the poor dog had casts on the back of his both legs. And, you know, Harry had to hold the dog upright whenever the dog had to pee, or else he'd just pee all over his casts. He didn't mind, though, because he loved the dog so much, because Meg loved the dog. Anyway, Guy was there when Harry decides to propose to Meghan. He says that one night at Notcott, there they are. He's laid a blanket out on the lawn of their house. He's popped some champagne. He's got Guy out there. He pours Meg some champagne, and she's like, "What's the occasion? What's up?" Like she doesn't have a clue. And he asks her out there under the stars next to Notcott if she would spend his life with him and make him the happiest guy on the planet. "Yes, you know I will." "Yes?" "Yes." They laugh together. In this mixed up world, this pain-filled life, they'd done it. They'd managed to find each other. What a wonder. Wonder, miracle of miracles. And here they are. They're laughing, they're crying, they're petting Guy. They're a solid team is what they are. And then as they're walking in the house, he asks her if she'd like to see the ring. And wouldn't you know it, she'd forgotten all about the ring. So like her. So like her. Not worried about the externals, not worried about the things. She'd forgotten about the ring, but when he showed it to her, she was so excited about it. And they managed to keep their little blissful secret for 2 whole weeks. And that's where we'll end. I don't have any last minute words to pull this all together because it's already such a long video. So I'll let you go. But golly, Harry, that was a long slog, you guys. I hope you made it. I hope you made it to the end. I'm proud of you if you did. I will see you again later this weekend. I hope you have a wonderful Friday, and we'll talk soon. Bye.